They were just a child, but their soul aged in silence. While others laughed, they listened. While others forgot, they remembered. Secrets weren't told to them, they leaked into their bones. This isn't a story of innocence lost. It's the haunting truth of a child who knew too much too soon. Chapter 1. The Silent Witness. They were just a child. Small hands, wide eyes, soft voice. But the world around them was loud, messy, and full of things they weren't supposed to hear. Adults spoke in half-whispers, thinking the child wouldn't understand. But they did. Not with words at first, but with feeling. The tension in the room. The way voices cracked. The silence that followed. They felt everything. They sat quietly in corners, behind doors, under tables. Not hiding, just unnoticed. And that's when the secrets came. Not directly, not intentionally, but they leaked. Through arguments, through tears, through the way someone slammed a drawer or left the house without saying goodbye. The child absorbed it all, like a sponge. Like a witness, they didn't ask questions. They learned not to. Questions made adults uncomfortable. Questions brought more silence. So they watched. They listened. They remembered. And slowly they began to understand things no child should have to. There's a kind of loneliness that comes from knowing too much. It's not the absence of people, it's the absence of innocence. While other children played, they calculated moods. While others laughed, they braced for impact. They became the emotional barometer of the house. If someone was angry, they felt it first. If someone was sad, they carried it quietly. One day they heard something they couldn't forget. A confession, a secret, a truth too heavy for their small shoulders. And yet no one noticed. No one asked if they were okay. No one realized that the child had just become a vault. They didn't tell anyone. Not because they were loyal, but because they were scared. Scared of what would happen if the truth came out. Scared of being blamed. Scared of being seen. So they locked it inside. And with every new secret, the lock grew tighter. They began to change. Not outwardly. They still smiled. Still nodded. Still did what was expected. But inside something shifted. They stopped dreaming. Stopped imagining. Stopped feeling safe. The world became a puzzle they had to solve to survive. There's a quote that fits here perfectly. Some children aren't raised. They're rehearsed, trained to perform calm while chaos dances behind their eyes. They became good at pretending, good at being okay, good at making others feel comfortable. But deep down they were drowning in stories that weren't theirs, and yet they never spoke. Because speaking meant breaking the spell. Speaking meant becoming visible. And visibility was dangerous. If you've ever felt like this child, if you've ever carried the weight of things you didn't choose, know that you're not alone. This story is for you. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to Soul of Phoenixx. This channel is a space for stories like yours, for healing, for truth, for transformation. Your presence here matters. Now let's follow the child deeper, into the place where those invisible stories began to shape their soul. Let's step into the weight they carried and the silence they became. Shall we? Chapter 2. The weight of invisible stories. They didn't know when it started. This quiet collecting of other people's pain. It wasn't a choice. It was just what happened. One moment they were a child and the next they were a container. A place where things were stored but never sorted. A place where voices echoed long after the room had emptied. They carried stories that didn't belong to them. A mother's regret, a father's silence, a sibling's fear. They didn't understand the full meaning, but they felt the weight. And over time, that weight began to shape them. Not like clay, soft and moldable. More like stone, layered, heavy, silent. They became careful. With words, with movements, with emotions. They learned to read the room before they entered it. They learned to shrink without disappearing, to be present without being noticed. It was a skill, a survival instinct, and it worked until it didn't, because the stories didn't stay quiet. They stirred, they whispered, they grew roots, and the child, still small, still soft, began to feel cracks forming inside. Not visible ones, not the kind anyone would ask about, but deep ones. The kind that make you question if you're real or just a reflection of everyone else. They started dreaming strange things. Rooms with no doors, voices with no faces, a sky that never changed. They didn't tell anyone. Who would understand? Who would believe that a child could feel haunted by things they never lived? They began to write, not full sentences, just fragments. Words that felt like keys, pages that felt like escape. But even the writing felt dangerous. What if someone read it? What if someone saw the truth? So they hid it, like everything else. There's a moment in every secret keeper's life when they realize they've forgotten their own story. It's not dramatic. It's quiet, like reaching for a memory and finding someone else's instead. They carried so many voices they forgot the sound of their own. They started to feel older than their age, not in body but in soul. They didn't relate to other children. Their games felt hollow, their laughter too loud. They preferred silence, preferred solitude, preferred the company of thoughts that didn't ask for anything. But even solitude has its limits. They began to feel tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. The kind that comes from holding too much for too long. The kind that makes you wonder if you'll ever feel light again. And yet they kept going, because that's what they were taught. To endure, to be strong, to protect others from the truth. Even if it meant losing themselves. They started to notice patterns. How certain words triggered memories. How certain smells brought back moments they never spoke of. They began to understand that the stories they carried weren't just emotional. They were spiritual. They had energy. They had shape. They had power. And that power was starting to leak. They felt it in their chest, in their dreams, in the way they flinched at kindness. They didn't know how to release it. Didn't know if they were allowed to. But something inside was shifting. Something inside was asking to be heard. They began to seek signs, in nature, in numbers, in the way the moon moved. They didn't call it magic, but it felt like something ancient, something that understood them without words. They weren't ready to speak. Not yet, but they were ready to listen. To the part of them that had been quiet for too long. To the part that wasn't a vault, but a soul. And so, the silence began to crack. Let's follow them now, not into the pain, but into the transformation. Into the rituals, the symbols, the cosmic whispers that begin to guide them home. Let's step into the moment where silence meets fire. Chapter 3. The Ritual of Return. They didn't know what they were searching for, only that something inside had begun to stir. A quiet ache, a pull towards something they couldn't name. It wasn't a voice exactly, more like a rhythm, a pulse beneath the silence. And they followed it. It led them to strange places. A book left open on a park bench, a candle flickering in a forgotten room, a dream that repeated itself 3 nights in a row. They didn't understand the meaning, but they felt it. Felt that something was trying to speak, not in words, but in symbols. They began to notice patterns, circles, mirrors, fire, water. Each one felt familiar, like pieces of a language they used to know. They didn't tell anyone. This wasn't something that could be explained. It was something that had to be felt. They started to create small rituals, not dramatic ones. Just quiet acts of remembering, lighting a candle before sleep, writing a word on a piece of paper and burying it in the earth, standing barefoot under the moon. These moments didn't fix anything, but they opened something. A door, a breath, a space where they could exist without pretending. They began to feel their own story again, not the one they were handed, not the one they were trained to carry, but the one that had been waiting. Beneath the silence, beneath the secrets, beneath the weight. It was fragile at first, like a whisper, like a flicker, but it grew with each ritual, with each moment of stillness, with each time they chose to feel instead of numb. They started to speak, not loudly, not to everyone, but to themselves, to the part of them that had been quiet for too long. They spoke through art, through movement, through breath, and slowly they began to hear their own voice again. It wasn't polished, it wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. They began to release the stories they had carried. Not all at once. Not with drama, but gently. Like leaves falling, like smoke rising. They didn't need to hold them anymore. They didn't need to be the vault. They were allowed to be the flame. They started to feel lighter. Not because the world changed, but because they did. They stopped asking for permission to exist. They stopped waiting to be understood. They began to live as if they were the center of their own story. And in that center they found something unexpected. Joy. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that demands attention, but the quiet kind. The kind that lives in small moments. In the way sunlight touches skin. In the way wind moves through trees. In the way their own breath feels when they're finally at peace. They weren't healed. Not completely, but they were healing. And that was enough. They began to walk differently, speak differently, see differently. Not because they were pretending, but because they were remembering who they were before the secrets, before the silence, before the weight. They were never just a child who knew too much. They were a soul who survived, who transformed, who returned, and now they carry something new. Not pain, but power. Not silence, but story. Not fear, but fire. They are no longer the vault, no longer the mirror, no longer the ghost. They are the phoenix, and they rise.